Let's hear briefly from our panelists as well what is happening in Zimbabwe. Of course, this is the first election after a long while of the ruling of Robert Mugabe, who was there for the longest. And we just want to see the same scenario that we had, of course, here in Kenya is what now they're experiencing about election or results delayed. Of course, the same sentiments that we can see also from the opposition. Let's start with Professor Naomi Damba. When we're talking about electoral reforms, also the electoral reforms is not really shaken into place as well.
Dubai, I'm currently reading a book called The Next Africa, which is written by Jack Bright and Hobby, published in 2015. And this book focuses on the next global power, and basically focusing on Africa as the only global power left. And there is sign that Chinese are coming, Americans are coming, Europeans are coming, all investors with future hopes are coming to Africa. We can do it with the issue of governance, corruption, ethnic strife, and insecurity, and total disregard to the law. We have to change our way. We have to change our mental health. We have to change the way we look at things for us. I mean, the time is right now. But we cannot change the way this continent is moving unless these few things I said change. And it's not only us. We cannot blame Chinese for coming and taking advantage. We cannot blame Americans for doing the same thing. No. So what is happening here is a class example of elsewhere. It was not too long we were about to slaughter each other in Kenya because of that. And then the desert country, then everywhere else. Enough is enough.
Enough is enough. Let's say from Ambassador Erastus Mwencha, of course you've been to Zimbabwe, you've held court with President Mugabe as well. Seeing this particular election and what is coming forth right now, what would be your reaction?
My word is that it's starting to be a familiar text that you hear in Africa now, another rigged election. I mean, as Noah is talking about, the next generation of Africa, it beats my mind. Because think of India, a country of 1-point-something billion people. When they go for polls, over 500 million people go to the polls. They announce results within 24 hours. And you don't hear all these kind of, stories. The reason I say familiar, when you start to hear Electoral Commission saying, oh, nobody else should talk about these elections, you look at mature democracies. You get your results in the US through CNN. What is this secrecy about? I mean, it is all familiar text of frustrating society. And the delays, we are now tarrying. Let's have proper elections in Africa, because elections have become a new phenomenon for conflict. Because they come, it is not properly run, you then have conflict, you then have these unity governments, and the cycle continues. In Zimbabwe, 2008 or 2007, even the African Union, unlike many other situations, refused to recognize the elections that was held there. So you forced a unity government. Now you have a new dispensation, and you would have thought this new team would have run an election nicely so that you can then forget the past and move on. But the election, everybody is now claiming victory. And that is a recipe for disaster. So I think we are in a very sad situation for Zimbabwe. The same thing goes for Mali. And I hope that as he talks about this new generation, this is one of the areas Africa now must reclaim and start to say, let's for goodness sake have elections that do not result in violence, that do not rob people the people's will.
Right, let's hear from
if I can use this term, Mzee Mwencha has reminded me of a moment back at an AU summit. I think it was Sharm el-Sheikh, which was just about the time that the results came through. It happened at the same time that the results came through for that particular election, 2007, 2008. Yeah? And I remember printing out and carrying about 300 copies of the SADC and AU observer reports for that election and handing them to as many people. And I remember one particular incident of bumping into President Kagame in a place I shan't say, but it was in a private place where men go to from time to time, and handing him a copy of this report. This is a true story, so I'm not telling any stories here that cannot be corroborated. And I remember saying, Your Excellency, please read this report before you have your meeting. I think at that time he was chairing one of the committees that was looking at the elections. But I think for Zimbabwe, what I'm touched with is really this is in 40 years, probably the first election without Robert Gabriel Mugabe. And for Zimbabweans, it must be an opportunity for them to make a break in the past. You know, this 30 years or 38 years since the since the independence in 1980. And I think there are probably a number of things that should be on the table. The first is, you know, there are a number of cases of forced disappearances, activists, politicians, ordinary people who basically stood up for their country's democracy that still are not accounted for. At least 15 cases still remain unopened. There are cases of excessive force by the Zimbabwean police service, which I think need to be investigated. So there are many things at stake in this election, and I do hope that the election passes without any violence and the bloodshed, but also that the result is acceptable to the people of Zimbabwe so that they can go about rebuilding the democracy that was there in the early 80s.
Right, thank you. Let's hear from Kanenje briefly before I take a short break, and Lucy.
Yeah, thanks for those comments.
I'm sorry about that frame about the room.
No, that's fine. It's okay.
Just in case our viewers don't know, men go to the room occasionally.
Exactly.
They call them the small rooms.
Yes. Yeah. It is indeed the first time in about 40 years that Zimbabwe is going to elections without Robert Mugabe, but Mugabeism runs very strong at the same time. But it's also true that it's the first time that Robert Mugabe is not going to be voting for ZANU-PF, as he did. And yes, he did not vote for ZANU-PF, the party he founded, and voted for the party he hated his entire life as president. Now, there is a challenge. Of course, what is, as the ambassador mentioned, it's something very familiar in African politics. Elections are held and they are not announced at the time they should be announced. As you did indicate, in a place like the US, we learn from MSNBC or CNN way ahead of the official announcement. Now, in Zimbabwe, there's something that is very challenging at this stage. You have two parties that are very, very strong. Even though what people don't really understand is they're also rooted in some of the tribal cleavaging. One is Shona, another one is Ndebele. Now, those from Matabeleland, they've been claiming they've been excluded from government for a very long time. They comprised the bulk of the MDC and the Changirai. And right now, the interesting thing is Robert Mugabe endorsed them, even though he seems to be alone in the process. And the refusal or the competition to announce results, parallel results by both parties, is a recipe for disaster. And I think leaders of the continent, they need to help Zimbabwe not slide down the path of chaos, because if that happens, either today, from what I'm hearing, around 3 results supposed to start coming in. If it happens and it's not accepted, I think there's going to be a lot of violence in Zimbabwe, and I think leadership needs to be helped at this stage. We should not watch that country descend into further chaos.
All right.
I think for me, it's the same script, right? And I feel like we can't ignore the history that they've been through and expect them to, what do we call it? Forget and move on.
Accept and move on.
Accept and move on. Yeah. I think that is the most unkind thing that we usually say to each other. It's not possible to accept and move on. And I feel like we need to moderate our expectations in as far as Zimbabwe is concerned, only because we need to understand the history, that there are people who believe that ni yetu, ni yangu. There are people who will do anything to achieve that. And when you have two people fighting over the same thing, at the end of the day, there has to be a winner. So for me, I would say let's moderate our expectations, but also strongly come out and avoid any form of violence that is just going to be so
Thank you.
typical.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Right.